So good evening. I'm Manny Garcia. I'm the editor of the Naples Daily News, and thank you for coming to our forum this evening. I want to sort of give you what the nexus of how our project came to be. And we have a terrifically talented reporter in Jacob Carpenter who covers courts for us. And what you always want in a journalist is somebody who's discerning, who's got an investigative skill and ability to see patterns. And Jacob just happened to be, he was covering courts and he was seeing these Dui manslaughter cases where some arrests were made immediately and others took much longer. So through his training, he decided, let me take a look at go beyond the small picture and try to look at a very big picture analysis, and hence the nexus of how the series came to be. And he was given, between his day job of covering courts, he was able to put together this project over the course, which seems like a year. So he worked, again, being fortunate working here, we got to work with Brett Blackledge, who's his investigative editor, Pulitzer Prize winner in his own right, and hence our series. And our goal has always been to just help improve the lives of citizens and make things right. I want to note that we did invite the Highway Patrol to be here this evening and attend the forum, and they declined. So, but if you've read the series, their spokesman Greg Bueno has made the case for the difficulties and sometimes where the cases take a while. But having said that, they're always welcome to spend time with us. With that, I want to introduce our panelists, and we're very, very grateful for them visiting with us today. Closest to me is Scott Walker. Walter, my apologies. So Scott Walter spent 30 years with the Highway Patrol, 25 years of those. This is why it's important to have him here. He spent them as a traffic homicide investigator. So he brings an extraordinary amount of insight. And since his retirement, you're working in what, accident reconstruction?
Yes. So
again, we have that kind of talent here with us today. We also have Sharon, how do you put it, Mar. So Sharon brings a tough perspective here. Her daughter, Jennifer Jenkins, passed away in December of 2011 in an accident that speaks very much into the issue we're dealing with here. And it took, was it 10 and a half months for an arrest to be made?
Yes.
And the case is still ongoing.
Right.
So she has, and then she'll talk about this more, is about how she's kept a journal. She actually wrote to the governor on this issue. And Donald Day is a veteran, prominent criminal defense attorney in our area who specializes, got an expertise in DUI and DUI manslaughter cases. And he's a former prosecutor, so he can speak to both sides of the issue. So with that, I want to open up, and I'll start with you, Scott. Tell us about what you see as what can be done to improve the system here. And I ask the same questions to all of you, but start with your perspective, what you've seen, and how can things be improved?
Well, I think one of the things that can be done is more and better training. The traffic homicide position is a corporal's position with the Highway Patrol, and what it does is that is the only position that you can work traffic homicides in. There's not a stepping stone where you go up the ranks in traffic homicide. So a lot of the troopers are using that just as a way to get a 10% raise between trooper and sergeant. And so they don't spend the time that is necessary in getting the training they need and the experience that they need. And they don't have that interest to make it a lifelong career, to do the best job they can. They just will go through the steps basically to get the homicide investigations done, and it is something that they will have so many cases that it's hard to keep them all straight. It's easier if you work one at a time, but the criminal ones always take precedence. You always have to put them at the head of the list. Some of the problems that they have are the management style. A lot of the sergeants that are over the traffic homicide squad have never been trained in traffic homicide. So they're not even aware of whether their corporals are doing a good job, if they're doing what they should, if they're using the right equations, if they're putting everything they can into these cases. That's probably one of the most important parts of it is having trained supervisors that know what they're doing to review these cases and make sure their corporals are doing a good job.
Okay. Sharon, talk about, I know you wrote to the governor over your frustration over the delays, and talk about your experience and just.
Well, with the highway patrol, the investigation did take a long time, and I did talk to the investigator quite a few times on the phone so that, you know, I could find out where the case was at different times. And he shared with me about budget cuts, that there weren't as many investigators as there had been previously. And he covered himself several counties. So while he's working on our case and producing a report for that, he may get a phone call about a fatality in another county, and he has to stop what he's doing and go investigate that. So, as you said, they're working on more than one case at a time. And to be able to produce the report that they will present to the state attorney took quite a while. And when he finally had completed his report, which I think was about 5 months, 5.5 after, then he had to submit it for review from various people in his department, and then they would give it back to him to edit it. It sat on his supervisor's desk for 7 weeks without getting okay to go ahead and proceed. And the edits that were made were very minor. So I did write to his supervisor and send a registered letter because I didn't see why a report that was already completed would be sitting there so long. And he called me and he said it was quite a coincidence. Just that day, the report he had looked at, and that very day, and he was going to have the corporal make some edits, and then it would be sent on. But he gave me his direct line. If I ever had a question, please feel free to call him. But of course, he never answers that phone. So I felt that he was not being truthful with me, nor did he seem to think that anyone had the intelligence to speak to him that didn't know that he just happened to look at that report that day. So those were things that I dealt with. The actual investigator was very helpful on the phone, and but it took a long time. And when the report was finally delivered to the state attorney's office, they got it there, and then the accident report was missing. They didn't submit them. I guess they have to submit both together. So that caused another delay. So, you know, it's not a system that's working well.
Yeah. So, Donald, come about this from the standpoint as a former prosecutor who's done defense work, and where do you see are the issues that need to be addressed? You talked about this is something that's been going on for a while, so talk about it from that perspective.
Well, one, I'm not sure it's fair to put a ton of blame on Florida Highway Patrol. There certainly is blame in various cases that we've all seen. But Florida Highway Patrol is one of the law enforcement agencies in this state that receives the least amount of funding. They don't have the staff or the personnel. And what we find more often than not is they're not adequately trained. I think what my colleague just referenced, training is a big issue. These accident scenes are extremely complicated from the perspective of when you have to come and testify, whether it's a civil or criminal case, regarding how an accident occurred. There's an awful lot of science involved in mathematical calculations and understanding crush data from vehicles and a lot of things that are incredibly complicated. And frankly, I think many times law enforcement officers have people in these jobs who have not had adequate training, or even if they've had the course and they've attended the course and they've successfully completed, they're not prepared to testify in a court of law. And we see that a lot where in some of these cases you will actually see prosecutors' offices calling additional witnesses that the states had to retain, a private accident reconstructionist or someone else to come in and assist. So the first problem is in training, and this has been going on for some time. We really need to make sure And as was just reflected also, if you have multiple accidents in a single county, which we have many times with fatalities, there may only be one accident traffic homicide investigator on duty. That traffic homicide investigator could be in Charlotte County, and the accident that just occurred could be on Marco. So that officer has to complete that investigation in Charlotte County and drive to Marco Island. As you can imagine, that presents a number of difficulties. Sometimes the longer evidence remains, the more complicated the process. It could rain and wash away evidence. Things could change with the evidence and the deteriorating in various methods. So it's been a problem for a while. So training is an issue. But it's more than just the training at the scene, because these cases go through a complicated process of individuals that gather the evidence, write the reports before their final submission to the prosecutor's office. The officer at the scene, the traffic homicide investigator, has a set of duties and responsibilities that homicide investigator will finish, write a report, and conclude. There may be 1, 2, or 3 other officers involved in the investigation that have a relevant part, that they have to complete their report. The physical evidence itself, oftentimes if the suspected driver has been tested, and most of the time there's blood tests that are done, those blood tests have to go to a laboratory, which goes to a laboratory in Tallahassee, which sits for a tremendous amount of time waiting to come back. Governor Scott has done an excellent job recently addressing this very problem with rape cases, where we have a backlog of rape cases not only in Florida but nationwide, primarily because we're waiting for this data to come back from the laboratories. I think Governor Scott just funded these laboratories with a substantial amount of additional funding in Tallahassee to speed the process along. So there's a lot of hands in the case, so to speak, and a lot of different agencies. You've got the investigating agency, you've got the laboratory agency that does the testing, you've got the Prosecutors Association, and these files move between these agencies. And one agency may not be satisfied with the information and make an additional request. Well, sometimes that request has to go back through 2 or 3 agencies before the process gets completed. Okay. So it's complicated. It's not easy just to say it's any one thing. It's a complicated process. And it's been going on for some time. I think the governor has recently addressed an issue that's going to help us substantially, and that is fixing the laboratory issues.
Right.
It's funny, we went backwards in the 40s and 50s in this country. Law enforcement agencies had laboratories within their facilities. The Collier County Sheriff's Office had a laboratory here when I started as a prosecutor 27 years ago. It was on Marco Island. And the problem was funding, but the great thing about that is we had things done locally. So when we needed blood tests or fingerprints done or anything else, it was done locally, and it was done in an expedited manner. Now, not everything was done locally. Even in those days, some things still went to Tallahassee. But I think we're going to have to take a hard look at these laboratories and how quickly they're able to produce and evaluate these things we're sending to them. So it's not any one thing, but there are a number of things I think that can be corrected that would certainly help the process.
Good, thank you. Scott, going back to you, one of the findings that from Jacob's series, in many cases where the facts seem very similar, the driver was intoxicated or under the influence, was behind the wheel, caused a fatality. In some cases, arrests are made immediately. In other cases, they just, again, drag on, and you end up with fugitives, as we've seen. Is there a lot of leeway given at the scene of the crash to the corporal who's investigating the case? Why is there so? It seems to be like it's archaic in the decision-making process.
Well, again, it has to do with the supervision too. There has to be an on-scene supervisor for each of the fatal crashes. He has to make that determination whether this individual needs to be arrested there on the scene, or it can wait until the investigation is through and all the lab results are in. The Highway Patrol has always had a hard time arresting somebody on the scene if they had injuries and needed to go to the hospital. And that's financially they would have to take care of those hospital bills if they did arrest them before they went to the hospital. Second of all, there's the issue of having so many cases that you've got to just play one against the other. You've got to take the criminal charges first, and sometimes you have several criminal charges. Some of them are on deadlines. When you arrest somebody on the scene, then you start a speedy trial period that you have to have everything done and ready for trial within 180 days. Now, the state attorneys that I've dealt with, there's some of them that say, I got to have that case on my desk in 30 days, and if it's not complete, then everything has to be there within 45 days so I can prepare this for trial. And that's totally unreasonable in a lot of these cases. I've waited as long as 2 years to get DNA results. In some instances, such as that case that took 2 years, it was more than our state lab could handle. They sent it off to the FBI lab. Somewhere in transit, it got lost, and we had to resubmit some evidence. But we didn't know about that until 1.5 years down the road. So there's a lot of things that build up and have to be taken into consideration on these cases. I do agree that in a lot of cases they do need to be arrested on the spot. But in most of those cases, it's ones that they are not injured and they are, say, intoxicated or under the influence of drugs, and it's very visible. And you can't allow them to go home and then go out and do the same thing again. So you have to arrest them on the spot. But there is a lot of pressure when you do that.
Sharon, I was going to ask if you can talk for our group here about one of the things that we've heard from family members is the psychological and emotional toll on families with these delays in these cases. Can you talk about that? Because I know that played into your decision to write the governor, as well as you've been much more proactive than many of the families we've talked to.
Well, it is. Number one, you know, it's such a shock when these accidents happen and you're faced with that sudden loss. I do want to mention too, with my daughter, was her best friend, Kathleen O'Callahan, was also killed in the accident. And our families went through, you know, a very rough time. And the delays, I mean, our case now has been going on for over 4 years. There's no trial date set as yet. And there's all sorts of delays. The defendant did flee for a while, and that's why he today is in jail, because of fleeing. It wasn't because of the accident. They set an extremely low bond for him. There was damage. My son-in-law was also injured in the accident. There was property damage, and the total bond was $20,000 for the life of 2 women plus 4 other charges. They ascribed a value for each woman at $8,750. He bonded out the next day. And of course, I was naive, you know, when this all first occurred. I never knew that they weren't arrested immediately. I did not know that they just could go on with their life and still drive on this state roads. And until he was actually put in jail, it was a big concern of mine that he may hurt somebody else, and that another family would have to go through this horrible experience that we were going through. So as I'm a native Floridian, and it makes me angry that the defendants are allowed to do this, that our case is pretty cut and dried. There was a lot of witnesses. Everybody knows that he did it. They have been delays because they want to make sure the defendant receives due process and there won't be any I's that are not dotted in the case when it does go to trial. But I think it's a real travesty that these drivers are out driving among all of us. We're all in danger from these people who have already killed someone, and their license is not taken away.
And Donald, how do you balance that, you know, again, protecting the due process and rights of your client, you know, versus, you know, whether you want to try to push a case along quicker, and how do you balance it? And plus the bad publicity that normally follows these cases and protecting your client.
You have to keep in perspective that the cases take some time to get through, but also keep in perspective that if you look at the conviction rate for DUI manslaughters, probably close to 98% of people charged with DUI manslaughter are ultimately convicted and go to prison. Now, that may not have been the case 10 years ago. I will tell you the law has come a long ways in 10 years. 10, 15 years ago, it was not uncommon DUI manslaughter cases for maybe somebody to serve a year. There were cases people got probation 20 years ago. The times have changed, and they've changed in response to not only the members of the public who have had family members who have died in these crashes. They've changed because, frankly, the public has said, you know, there needs to be changes. The sanctions need to be more severe. So a lot has changed in the last 10 years or so. But there's a balancing act always there. It takes time to complete the depositions. It takes time to complete the motions that need to be filed. I think the frustration comes many times from the families when things are postponed because they haven't been done timely. A good example is this case where this poor lady has waited for someone to call her back for 7 weeks. I mean, those are the kinds of things that the family gets very frustrated about because there's no one talking to them and explaining to them the process. I have found in these cases that if things are working the way they're supposed to work and everyone is on top of their game and the tests have been done as quickly as possible and the laboratory has done their job and the prosecutors filed the charges, that the people are very understanding of the time it takes to go through the process. Where they become very frustrated is that where no one's answering their questions or someone has dropped the ball. And those cases happen, unfortunately, and that is extremely frustrating. And we're seeing that. I mean, a prime example, as my colleague said, he had a case where he waited 2 years for DNA tests to come back. So most of these DUI manslaughter cases, if you really trace down the delay, a substantial amount of the delay is in the laboratory results. We wait sometimes 6 to 8 months to get a blood test tested for alcohol. Naples Community Hospital can test it in 2 hours. 2 hours they could be done with the testing. So now, in defense of the laboratory again, they have 5,000 or 6,000 on a shelf. So you can only test so many a day and you only have so many employees. So there are remedies there, I think, too, that can be solved. And it's back to the idea of, for blood testing, it is not a complicated process. It could be done locally. It could be done with private firms. It could be done with giving local law enforcement the budget to do it. We can have an answer back in these blood tests within 5 days. It's not a complicated process. So the mechanisms are there. I mean, we have science now that can do a lot of things, and we're still waiting for blood tests to come back for 8 months. It's unacceptable, and it doesn't need to happen. So there are things that can be fixed. And I do think there are changes that have been happening in the last few years. And I know Steve Russell, our elected state attorney, has put a gentleman in charge of these DUI manslaughter cases who is top-notch. He's on his game. He is very thorough, very efficient, 7 days a week kind of guy working at these cases. And he is doing an excellent job. So there's a lot of things happening in the system to address these concerns. But there are still things that are not being addressed that I think we can fix, and the laboratory is the prime example.
I'd like to just make one comment that it seems to depend on where the accident happens. I mean, we're all residents of Florida. It shouldn't make a difference if your accident occurred in Hardy County or Collier County, that the laws and the process would be different. And it has been extremely different in Hardy County. It's a totally different system up there. We've been waiting for a year and a half because the defense lawyer wanted to hire an expert witness. And a year and a half later, there's been no report, no information from the expert witness, and that's what is the point that's holding our case up right now. That's been a year and a half, but there's no repercussions, you know, about this. There's no time limits given to the defense saying, you know, you have to give me the information by such and such a date. And unfortunately, in our case, we have a defense attorney that sometimes forgets to come to court. So, you know, it's compounded by a lot of reasons outside the regular system of the reports and the blood tests and all that.
Good point. Scott, I was going to ask you, what's a determining factor if it's going to be the Florida Highway Patrol versus, say, for example, whether it's a Marco crash or in the city of Naples or the Collier County, that it's going to be investigated by the FHP versus, for example, Collier County Sheriff's Office or Lee County Sheriff's Office or City of Fort Myers?
Well, in every county in this state, it's different, and it depends on the sheriff whether he allows his deputies to work crashes or not. And some counties, like Orange County, the sheriff prohibits his deputies from getting involved in accidents.
Why would that be?
That I really couldn't tell you. I don't know. It's been from the three sheriffs that I know of in Orange County. It's always been that way, and it's just their county. Volusia County, we trained the Highway Patrol trained the deputies in Volusia County, and they will race the Highway Patrols to get to the homicides because they want that experience. It just depends on the particular sheriff. Now, if the city, if it's a large city that has a traffic homicide squad, can handle the traffic fatalities, then they will do it within their city limits. If it's a smaller city that doesn't have a large police department, they don't have the manpower to train them in traffic homicides, so they will refer those to the Highway Patrol. And everything in the unincorporated areas of the county, if the sheriff doesn't have a traffic homicide squad for that county, then the Highway Patrol will work those cases.
Don, I wanted to turn to you because one of the things that we found here is the lack of policy or on the issue of extraditions, where you have defendants. Jacob found one gentleman involved in a fatality in Collier County who fled to Colombia. We found him through Facebook where he's just having a good old time. But have you had to deal with extraditions? Like some countries say, this is not a serious enough of a crime to extradite here. So if you can talk about, because I'm unclear how extraditions work.
Extradition works by politics. That's how it works. So extradition is a very complicated process because it depends on so many different factors. The country you're trying to extradite from, the treaty that exists between the United States and that country, because every country just about has a treaty with the United States, and within that treaty is the extradition parameters, what each country will or will not do regarding extradition. For instance, countries that don't believe in the death penalty may not allow extradition of someone who is charged with a murder case looking at the death penalty. So there's a lot of complicated factors in there, and it's very, very political. You see every night on the news where if it's a very high-profile political case, it's funny how someone can be extradited in 24 hours. And then cases that are not high-profile, with the very same charges, there can be years that go on without extradition. Extradition is a complicated, lengthy, costly process. And I think it really just depends on the jurisdiction that's seeking to extradite the person, the country that they're in, and how willing they are to do the paperwork and the legwork to get it done. Countries that are very friendly to the United States, and by friendly I mean that we give money to, they tend to allow extradition a lot more freely. They tend to cooperate a lot more with extradition. So extradition is a complicated process and a very political process, but almost every offense is extraditable, which means we can bring them back. It's just a matter of how bad we want them and do we want to go through the process of getting them.
If I could add something to that.
Sure, please.
One of the things there also in extradition is the cost, and that even works between states. The states in the United States, if the crime is not deemed to be serious enough, they won't pay, the local sheriff's department will not pay to have that person extradited back to the state. My experience with the state attorneys that were like division heads would sometimes come in and give us pointers how to do our job better. But they always told us that they considered traffic homicide as a misdemeanor murder, and they don't put a lot of effort into those. That's happened throughout my career. I've had cases where, in this case, where you've got somebody that's interested in a family member, the state attorney puts more precedence on that case. I had many cases that I had good cases that they wouldn't prosecute because there was nobody that was putting any pressure on them. And we don't hear about those. We hear about the ones that are prosecuted, and then the state attorney ultimately wins or loses, but in most cases they win those cases. But if there's a chance that they can't take a plea or take it to a successful trial, they won't even prosecute those cases.
Well, that leads to one of the questions that came up for us in this discussion on the project was, and a question that's come up from readers has been, well, how different is this from if you've got a homicide investigator, because instead of it being a car, it was a gun or a knife. You know they committed. You've got a fatality. You know they used instead of a gun or a knife, they used a car. So why is there a different? Why is it different?
Well, it's the way they've classified those, whether it's a vehicular homicide is a third-degree felony. When you get into the leaving the scene of accidents, the DUI manslaughters, those are second-degree felonies. You don't ever get to the point of a first-degree felony with traffic homicide. Sometimes you can get to a second-degree murder charge when, say, a department is chasing somebody and it resulted in a fatality. That is doing, they're taking actions that they should expect somebody to die in, and so they will upgrade that to a second-degree murder. But in most cases, they don't look at those third-degree murders as being all that serious.
You wrote a very poignant letter to the governor, and I wanted to ask you just, what do you see as an opportunity to change policy or improve things?
Well, I actually wrote 2 letters to the governor. The first one was making him acquainted with the case and problems that we were incurring. And the second letter I wrote, I was asking for assistance because the defendant had fled.
Where did the defendant flee to, do you know? Or?
North Carolina.
Okay.
And it was strange because my son-in-law had spoken to the bail bondsman at one point, and he alluded to the fact that he was probably in North Carolina. And other information we received, it seemed to be that maybe they really did know where he was, that they knew he was in that state, and whether he had relatives there, I'm not sure. But I asked him, for assistance. Unfortunately, when I wrote that letter, he was up for re-election, and there were many sheriffs that were endorsing him for re-election. And number 1 on the list was the Polk County Sheriff, and that's where the defendant lived. He had been arrested quite a few times in Polk County before he was arrested in Hardy County. So, there was roadblocks, and he never, the first letter he told me, if you have any questions, anything I can do for you, please contact me. And so when the defendant fled, I thought, well, he told me to contact him, so I did, and I never heard anything. I think obviously that the defendant in our case was on probation at the time of the accident, and he actually was arrested in Polk County after the accident. I feel that he wasn't being properly supervised, and I'm not.
Was he on probation for DUI or another?
Another offense, but it was probation. And, when these people have this background, I don't understand why there isn't closer supervision. But at the same time, I'm not really up on the probation system and the reporting that goes on, but obviously there it's very lax. And I think that there needs to be tighter laws to protect the drivers out on the road against these people.
Okay. So we wanted also, if you have questions, we'll be more than happy to take questions from the audience. We want to make it a interactive thing. I think we've got one back there. And let us know your name, state your name. And
Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Nasta. I'm a retired New York City police manager, 30 years, NYPD. And I want to commend you for the article. I'm a part-time resident in Lee County, and I felt really upset when I read the story. Probable cause, to me, is spelled out when an officer comes on the scene. There's bottles in the car, there's slurred speech, and that's enough to make an arrest in New York, probably in Florida. I think training is probably a big issue. I think also the politics of sheriffs making their own policy is another issue that goes way beyond this matter. But for me to see a man walk away from a vehicular homicide because they don't have time to put him in a hospital, I just don't get it. And thank you for doing it, for having this conference.
Don, you want to weigh it, and then
Well, I'm not
And then
sure
Scott.
if there's a question, but
probable cause or maybe.
probable cause? Okay. I will tell you that I have been baffled more than once with cases that I have seen where there's an officer at the scene and 3 officers agree that the person is intoxicated, there's a bottle of liquor, their person is taken to the hospital, they're clearly intoxicated, there's an accident that looks like their fault, and an arrest is not made until 8 months later when the blood test comes back. And that always surprises me a little, because frankly, in a fatality case like that, with 3 or 4 trained officers there who witnessed the defendant's behavior and can testify on their training experience regarding what they observed and what they saw, the prosecutor has the ability then to subpoena the records from the hospital and get the doctor to come in to say, yes, I treated this defendant, and when I came in contact with this defendant, there was an odor of alcohol and the person seemed impaired. I don't even need a blood test to win that case in front of a jury. We want to have that, obviously. That's important, and it's good always to have as much evidence as possible. I'm not suggesting that that's not a good thing. I'm just saying that there are many instances where there's more than enough evidence to make an arrest. So the reason we don't do it, or the reason that we say we don't do it a lot of times, is because, well, we don't have all the evidence. We don't have that blood test back yet. We don't have those other things back. And we're kind of going in circles back to the beginning of where I started. If the officers made that arrest that night, and we had the ability to prepare that report in 2 or 3 weeks and do those mathematical calculations and skid mark calculations, and we had a trained officer who could do that, it could be done within a couple of weeks without any great difficulty. And we had a lab that had the results back in 2 or 3 weeks. Within 30 days, not only will we have already placed the defendant under arrest, we should have completed our investigation and had back those blood tests and ready to go. And there's no reason that's an unreasonable timetable. There are cases, you can't apply a rule to every single case because it doesn't work that way. My clients want to do that, and the public wants to do that. Oh, I saw in the newspaper so-and-so happened with this guy or this girl. Every case is different. There will be cases that's going to take 8 months to put together. We got to track witnesses. We're having difficulty proving an element of the crime. That's going to happen. We're never going to fix that completely. But there are other cases, many other cases, that these arrests can be made and we can conclude these investigations much more timely if we provide the training and the resources to do it. So the gentleman has an excellent point. The probable cause is something that's pretty easy to put your finger on. We just need to fix the backside, that when we make that arrest, we're completing the rest of the process timely. And that's what we need to fix.
I'd love to hear from you. Again, 25 years as a traffic homicide investigator, just your insight into the question from the audience.
Well, there's a lot that goes into making that decision as to whether you make that arrest right there or not. Again, one of the problems was that we did not want to arrest somebody that was going to be admitted into the hospital because we didn't want to put the money into that hospital bill that we would be responsible for as far as the highway patrol. That was one issue that came up, and a lot of times when we were ready to arrest them before they got to the hospital, they'd already left the hospital on their own without the okay from the hospital. In some cases, we never even see the defendants or the suspects. They will be transported to the hospital and then they'll disappear. We never see those people. I had one individual from Iran that was a student here at UCF, and he was involved in an accident that he was clearly DUI. He was transported to the hospital and his family got him out before I could even get to the hospital. And last I heard, we had the warrants issued, and we heard that he, from Border Patrol, that he had crossed the border into Canada and he was gone. There's cases that we have no control over. If we have an individual that is clearly, we have all the probable cause that he is DUI, we can, and he's not injured or he's not seriously injured, then we can go ahead and make that case, and we should make that case right there on the spot, or at the hospital if he has to have some minor injuries treated. A lot of times that's the supervisor on scene. That should be their decision as to whether that should happen or not. The homicide investigators have a lot going on. The way the Highway Patrol does it is they have one homicide investigator that is in charge of everything that goes into that investigation. They have other homicide investigators that assist them in certain things, but they don't take an active role in any part of that homicide investigation other than maybe taking photographs or interviewing witnesses or something like that. They aren't responsible for any part of that investigation. That is that lead investigator that does that. Since I've been in the private practice, I have seen departments such as like the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department, that they put personnel on that thing and they just flood it with whatever they need to do to get it done. And they have timely investigations. They are more than open to outside investigators if they want information from it. That should be the epitome of how a department handles those investigations. But I've had cases that they're extremely private. They will not share anything with the outside investigators. Whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, they won't answer a question. West Palm Beach is a good example on that. They won't give you any information unless you have a court order or the state attorney actually allows you to get that information. And that's being protective in one instance, but it's also very hard on the investigators, the accident reconstructionists that have to go back and hold the police departments accountable.
If I can say one thing in response to that maybe we ought to clarify, because I think it'd be helpful. When we talk about a DUI manslaughter, we talk about a lot more serious crime than a regular DUI. And there's different elements that have to be proven. And one of the elements in a DUI manslaughter is that you have to prove the person was operating the car while they were impaired, and then you have to prove causation for the accident. So when we're throwing around this terminology of the homicide investigator, the causation of the accident is at issue. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's a drunk driver sitting in a stoplight, and someone plows into the back of them, and the passenger in that person's car dies. Well, the person who's drunk sitting at the stoplight could not be charged with DUI manslaughter because it's not that driver's fault, even though they're drunk. However, they could still be arrested for DUI, simple DUI. So the complicated process in a DUI manslaughter is, and this is where the homicide investigator comes in, we need to be able to establish not only is the person impaired in driving the car, but was the accident their fault? Because the prosecutor must prove in that case that it was the fault of the impaired driver that resulted in the fatality. The reason I'm making this point is back to the gentleman's argument regarding probable cause. There is absolutely no reason that you cannot have probable cause at the scene of an accident, even though you may not have concluded at that point whether that driver caused the accident. The traffic homicide investigator, it may take them 4 or 5 hours to measure skid marks, speak to eyewitnesses, and conduct the investigation. But there's no reason, as long as you have probable cause to believe the person's impaired and you can prove they were driving the car, that you cannot arrest them for DUI. May not be DUI manslaughter, but it could be DUI. And then upon the prosecutor's review of the case a month to a month and a half later, by that point presumably, the traffic homicide investigator's case has been completed, the blood test has come back, and now if you have enough, you can up-file the charges from simple DUI to DUI with a DUI manslaughter. So there is the ability to make a probable cause arrest, even though you may not have the evidence you need at that point. You can gather that evidence later, and you can always modify or increase the charges. And that's done quite frequently in not only DUI cases, but other criminal cases, where murder cases is a good example. Someone may be arrested on a second-degree murder or something like that. And it takes the prosecutor's time to indict the person for first-degree murder. And it takes a little bit of time for that to happen. So there's no reason that the same process couldn't function in a DUI manslaughter. So the arrest can be made if there's probable cause, even for a simple misdemeanor at that point, and it could be up-filed later to a felony if that evidence comes in.
Yeah, Jacob did find several cases where there was clear probable cause. Somebody was behind the wheel. A doctor testified that, in fact, one case out of Miami where the driver killed 5 people, the doctor testified this guy was clearly under the influence, and he even said that he was from Brazil, and they let him go, and he's still missing.
I'll tell you locally, Sheriff Rambosk, how he deals with this, and it's a good method. When the Collier County Sheriff's Office is investigating a traffic homicide, if they have reason to believe the person is impaired and a fatality has occurred, even if there's not a fatality, they'll do this sometimes, and the driver gets transported to the hospital. Law enforcement goes to the hospital. They haven't placed the driver under arrest at that point, but they go to the hospital, and they wait outside of that hospital room. And when the person is finished with their treatment, if there's enough probable cause at that point to arrest for a crime, they are arrested as soon as they finish with their treatment at the hospital. So they don't have the ability to walk out of that hospital and get on an airplane and fly back to Peru, because law enforcement, the sheriff's office, is waiting at the door of the hospital room, guarding that room. They haven't arrested yet. They're simply guarding the room for when the doctor medically clears that person, and then they put the handcuffs on them and they arrest them, provided there's evidence for probable cause. So our local law enforcement agency does a very good job with that issue by that process of simply waiting at the hospital. And by that time, when they're at the hospital, many times they've received a radio back to the hospital. Hey, we've wrapped up the accident investigation. We've concluded the car was going 100 miles an hour. We've concluded it ran a stop sign. We've talked to the medical examiner. There are 2 fatalities. There's enough evidence for DUI manslaughter, and they make the arrest right there. So, and I think she makes an excellent point regarding the jurisdictions. There are so many different processes that take place with these cases, and each county seems to be a little bit different. I do cases all over the state. I've prosecuted in Broward County, and I prosecuted here in Collier County for some period of time before I became a defense lawyer. And I will tell you that the point she's making is a good one, that there are a lot of different processes, and each place seems to do things somewhat differently. Now, a lot of the reasons go back to that local law enforcement, especially in a small community, just don't have the expertise to be able to provide someone who can do an accident reconstruction and then testify in a competent manner later on. So they rely very heavily on the Highway Patrol, who in theory has a trained officer there who will not only be able to conclude the investigation, but be able to testify later. You know, it's a 2-part process. Simply completing the investigation and reaching a conclusion is one thing. You got to be able to go to court and testify it and have the ability to testify in a competent manner in front of a jury, and sometimes those are 2 different things. Back to training again.
Sharon, I was going to ask you, I'm trying to get my head around the fact that the bail bondsmen know that this person's likely in North Carolina, but they're a fugitive, and you've got this lag to make an arrest. How did that play out?
Well, there have been some errors made in our case by various people. A couple judges have made some errors, and the judge, I don't know if the proper terminology, rescinded the bond. In other words, the bail bondsman would not be responsible for coming up with $20,000. And it was an error on the judge's part, which he corrected through paperwork. And once the bail bondsman was told that he did have to come up with $20,000 on Monday, he suddenly was able to locate the defendant. So, you know, it was a mistake in paperwork. It was communicated to the bail bondsman. He thought that he was off scot-free, and then when he found he wasn't, then he suddenly found him. There was supposed to be no bond set when the defendant was arraigned in North Carolina, and the judge up there set bond. When he was brought back to Hardy County, which was about a month later, it was on a weekend, and it was not a regular judge there, and he set a bond. And luckily, the people that work at the jail knew the case and knew that there was not supposed to be any bond, and called the judge from our case so that he could make arrangements not to set bond. So, you know, it's a comedy of errors sometimes that these different things have occurred in the case. You know, we're trying to just persevere and be positive. You know, Jen has a little girl who's 4.5 now, and I think we've all conducted ourselves in the best way possible to give her a positive, happy outlook on life. And it is important to present to her that justice was served. At times, of course, it becomes very difficult for us when it goes on so long. And the last hearing we attended, one of the attorneys in the courtroom knew who we were and said that we're the first family they've ever seen that have come to all the pretrial hearings. And, you know, it's a total day of 4 hours of travel for us. And when we get there for the 1:30 hearing, the courtroom is not run real tight. Sometimes it starts at 2, sometimes it's 2:15. We never really know. And the lawyers sign in and they go according to the order that they sign in. And as I said, the the defense attorney is not, when he does remember to come, he's not always there very early. So we sometimes spend the afternoon there. And when he didn't show up the last time, we had to listen to all the cases that came through that day. And then they gave him the benefit of the doubt that he would actually, appear. And then when he didn't, the judge had the state attorney call him. And they did the hearing with him on the phone. So he was accommodated. And the other time that he did not appear, he asked the state attorney to ask us if we would move the hearing to the following Tuesday. Now, we had already been there for several hours, and he wanted us to come back. And we were pretty adamant that, that is a major inconvenience. We're working people that have to make all sorts of arrangements. So he did manage to get there in 30 minutes.
Wow.
But those things are, when you're already frustrated with the process, it just seems very disrespectful too, and that bothers me a lot. But we just have to keep plugging along and hope that someday we will actually get a trial date. He was offered a plea several years ago, but then he fled. Okay. He's accumulated a certain amount of points in the Florida system, so he could get life by totaling the points. So that kind of changed his perspective, I think, that it's a bit more serious.
Okay. Any other questions from audience members? Go ahead.
My name's Dan Young. I'm a retired Detroit area suburban deputy chief in charge of about, at the time, 90 personnel as a head of the Detective Bureau, homicide investigation, handled a few myself personally, also head of the Traffic Bureau. It seems to me that in this particular incident in Florida State Patrol and that the main issue is lack of training, failure of supervisors to allow their officers to spend the time on an investigation. A lot of this out on the street is a situation where what we did, we trained the officers. We had 2 investigators in our small department, which consisted of about 80 personnel. They were fatal investigators. We called them in, and then the other officers, we called in officers for overtime. There's a lot in my background. I can just see the supervisors saying to themselves, well, we're not getting funding, we can't get the officers here, we got these officers that have to answer other incidents out on the scene, we'll let the guy go and we'll do it later. Well, doing it later costs you a lot more money than it does than investigating the incident right now. And I feel bad for a victim's family that they'd have to go through that kind of stuff. In fact, reading that article as a law enforcement officer for 28 years, my father was a law enforcement. I currently have a son that's a current deputy, chief of police in one of the cities up in Wisconsin, that this is outrageous and it shouldn't be tolerated. And the idea that to get evidence such as a breath test, we used to get warrants and we'd have the hospital pull the blood from the individual and we'd have a simple test. It would come back in a few days. And like the previous retired officer said, it's simple. A preliminary exam is simple because you need the probable cause. You're not going to trial. And if you undercharge them, as the gentleman, the panelist said, you don't take a plea until you know what you got, the total incident, and you can upcharge them later. You can do all that at the beginning, and you'll save a lot of money and a lot of effort, and you'll save a lot of grief for the victims of these incidents.
That sort of ties to your issue about the training budget and the importance of the role of the supervisor too.
Well, and there's a management issue that is different in every single department. You don't know how that homicide investigator got to where he was, what training he's gotten, how much experience he's had. I can speak for the Highway Patrol that the corporal's position is the only position that you can work traffic homicide investigations. The sergeant, even the sergeant that's over the traffic homicide squad, doesn't necessarily know anything about traffic homicides. When he reviews a report, he just basically looks at the grammar and has no idea what the content is. If the Highway Patrol had a system that they would encourage the investigators to spend their career in traffic homicide, they would have a lot better opportunities to get the training they need, to spend the time and get the experience they need. But the Highway Patrol, the troopers use that as just a stepping stone to get extra money in
The
pay.
10% raise.
The 10% raise. And there's very few of us that ever spent their whole career from the time they were promoted to corporal until they retired. And those were the ones that had that drive and that passion for that particular investigation. To me, that was one of the best positions in the Highway Patrol, and it was our bread and butter. That was the thing that the Highway Patrol should be known for throughout the state, is they should be the experts. I handled a lot of cases for the smaller departments where the investigators were not that well trained or had no experience. I would go in there and show them and teach them at the time that I was working their case for them. And so they could get that extra training. I've assisted in my career Orlando police officer that he'd been on a traffic homicide squad for 6 years and only worked one traffic homicide. So they don't have that opportunity, and every single department is different. But I think it has a lot to do with the way they operate and the way that they are managed as to whether those investigators should be experienced and trained. In my 25 years, I was only able to go to 6 outside schools to increase my expertise in the training. There was always a fight for per diem. There was always a fight for the time that I'd be away from my job. In the 25 years, the only time that I was really caught up in all my cases was the day I retired. I transferred from Orlando to DeLand hoping I would get a little bit of a break. They had a good squad there, very, very competent. And it seemed like everybody went on vacation when I arrived there. And I came during Biketoberfest, and in 2 weeks I got 8 homicides, 6 of them motorcycle homicides. So, I mean, it's just, this is the way it operates all over the state. In some cases, you've got 1 or 2 troopers that are homicide investigators that have to cover 4 or 5 counties. And that takes a lot of time. The travel time is unbelievable. And so the time that they have to spend on that homicide, they don't get that much time to actually do the homicide investigation. So it's rough everywhere. I think the Highway Patrol has one of the roughest jobs, though.
Yeah.
We should put in perspective, too, that the law enforcement officers in the room will be able to tell you that if you've ever been to an accident scene with a fatality, and I've been to a number of them, it is chaos because you've got vehicles involved, you've got EMS, you've got fire, you'll have Highway Patrol, you'll have local law enforcement providing assistance, and sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 jurisdictions there. If it happens on the line between Marco and Naples, you might have Marco PD there, you might have Sheriff's Office there, Highway Patrol. So these scenes are chaotic. And if you think about it, every little thing at that scene is of importance. Every firefighter who may have come in contact with the defendant or come in contact with the deceased, EMS personnel, the photographs that might have been taken. There's news reporters there sometimes. News reporters run videos and clips. They can be vital pieces of evidence. And if you've got one traffic homicide investigator at this scene and you have all of these entities and agencies there, you could imagine, on top of the fact that you need to make sure you secure the perimeter and no one comes in and the cars don't move and no one moves any of the items that are laying in the roadway, until you do all of those things and secure that scene, it takes some time. It is a chaotic situation, and it takes the cooperation of multiple law enforcement agencies. So we don't want to oversimplify this process because it is an extremely complicated process just to secure the scene and gather the evidence. And we haven't even started talking about doing the reconstruction work, which sometimes can take a day or a day and a half, where you're measuring skid marks and looking at the crush of the vehicles, and you're doing mathematical calculations, and you're interviewing witnesses. So it is a very complicated process that requires a degree of expertise that some Harvard graduates would have problem doing. So it is not a simple task. It's not just a matter of going to the scene and taking some pictures and saying, oh, they look drunk, everything looks great here. So it is a complicated process, and that's why training is so very important.
Absolutely.
For not only the investigator, but for the other officers at the scene too.
So we had another question here at the front.
Good evening. First of all, thank you for running this panel. My name is Bob Sabrinsky. I'm from Downers Grove, Illinois. I'm not a policeman. I'm not a retired policeman, but unfortunately, I joined the lady on the panel because I lost a daughter in 2004, 21 years old, at the hands of a drunk driver in Illinois. And I express my sympathy to you and your family. We're now in a club we never wanted to be part of. But what I'm hearing here and what I read in your articles, and I really appreciate the 4 articles I read in the paper, because every time I see DUI, I mean, I'm involved now in an organization back in Illinois. I don't know if anyone ever heard of it. It's called AIM. Everybody's heard of MAD, right? M-A-D-D. In Illinois, in the Chicago 6-county area, we have an organization I'm part of. It's called Alliance Against Intoxicated Motorists. And we have a website, aim1.org. And what this organization does, basically, and they helped us, my family, out tremendously, if we have what we call victim advocates. And I don't know if I'm asking if you have anything like that in Florida, like for an example, when a family gets thrown into a situation like this and you go into court. Well, you've never been there before and you don't know what's going on. We were lucky we had a victim advocate who walked us through all the court cases in my daughter's case. Her case, I could see how things take time. Just for example, hers took 18 months with the gentleman that pleaded guilty. But again, there were blood tests involved, and actually in her situation, he was taken to the hospital right after the crash, and when he was put in the bed, he was put handcuffs on right away. So there was no way he was going to be an escape out. But one of the things I heard here, and this is what floored me, did you say, I'm just questioning if I heard it right, it was only a $20,000 bond? Oh my God. Is that like a normal amount in Florida, or is that just weird that it's so low?
I think it's extremely low, and I don't know of anywhere else that in Collier County would be much, much more.
Because, like, for example, I'm in DuPage County, which is right outside of Cook County. In my daughter's case, it was a $1 million bond. Mm-hmm. And in Illinois, you have to put up 10% cash. You can't pledge a house. We don't have bail bondsmen either in Illinois. They just don't have them. So, I mean, I'm hearing the differences here, and I'm just wondering. And see, another thing the organization has, AIM, we also have what they call, and that's funded through the Illinois Department of Transportation, court watchers. Court watchers go into these courts a lot, look at what the judges are doing, write up reports, and kind of the judges become aware. And I know how you mentioned, I think one of the gentlemen mentioned how important it was for families to be present. And I made, fortunately, the job position I had at the time, I worked for the government, I could take a day off, a leave day. I attended every one of my daughter's hearings. And believe me, Illinois is the same as what you have here. You go for a 10 o'clock call, and finally you get called at 12:30, and they say, oh, continued for 2 months. But I made every one of them, and I think when it finally came to sentencing in our case, it was very evident to the judge when he came down with the final verdict. I even know the gentleman pled guilty. And in Illinois, on a homicide with vehicle, you can get 3 to 14 years. I don't know what the rule is in Florida. In our case, this was his first offense. Matter of fact, when the prosecutor brought up the driving record, they said, oh, this gentleman had 2 offenses, a stop sign and a seatbelt. And the judge looked and he says, I consider that minor. However, when you took someone's life in your hands and you eliminated that, he gave him 4 years on his first offense, 48 months. And in Illinois, again, I don't know what your Florida law is, maybe it's the same, you have to serve, if there's bodily injury or death, you must serve 85% of that sentence. So he had to serve the full 42 months. And again, I'm expressing my sympathy to you, and I hope you get the justice you deserve. It's a long process. Again, what they told me from the and again, ours took 18 months. They wanted to make sure every T was crossed, every I was dotted, which it was, because God forbid you don't want to go through an appeal and do this later on. Good luck.
Thank you.
Don, I was going to ask you, does that bond seem, that seems awfully low, or is it unusual?
Bonds are a whole nother topic we could spend
Okay.
4 special editions for the Naples Daily News with. But, you know, bonds varies greatly from every county. The difference between Lee and Collier can be extreme. So there is no norm that I can tell you, but bonds typically in cases involving fatalities of any kind are very high bonds, as you could imagine. So I would say $20,000 is a pretty low bond in that case. Doesn't mean that that's the only place in Florida that's occurred at. I'm sure it happens in other places, maybe even lower, but bonds depend greatly on the jurisdiction you're in and the judge you're in front of.
Sharon, I was going to ask you, do you have a victims counselor, somebody assigned from the state attorney's office to your case?
No.
And we do have, just if I can comment on that there is a process for that, for victims advocate.
Right.
And it's usually done by the state attorneys in each jurisdiction who have their own victim advocates. Steve Russell, our local elected state attorney, has a victims advocate unit that is with the victims at all times, is available for phone calls regarding the status of the case. If they'd like to speak with the prosecutor, they go through the victims advocate who can get them on the phone right away with the prosecutor. They tell them about upcoming court dates. So we do have that. We're very, very fortunate. And I think that's a trend that is catching on more and more. And I think we will see in the future in Florida that there will be victims advocates in every jurisdiction, not only to address manslaughter cases, but there to provide assistance. You know, Florida's a rare state. We passed an actual constitutional amendment years ago that provides rights for victims of crimes. It's one of the few places that victims have a constitutional right. You always hear about the constitutional right of the accused. Well, in Florida, victims have a constitutional right to be consulted about what's going on with the proceedings, to be advised when things of significance or importance are happening, and to be consulted before any resolution is reached in the case. Plea bargaining, for example, victims are consulted before that happens, or they're supposed to be. And then they have a right to speak or say what they believe is appropriate at the sentencing phase. So victims actually have a constitutional right in this state to have a fair involvement in the proceedings. So the victims advocate helps out substantially, and I think in the future we will see that's going to be statewide in every jurisdiction. And remember, the constitutional rights of the victims, I think, provide another substantial tool that the victims in these cases can use to provide the kinds of answers that they need. And perfect example is sitting right next to me, you know.
I will say that the state attorney who is prosecuting the case has always made himself available to us. Anytime we call, email, you know, he always gets right back to us. So that hasn't been an issue. He, you know, if we have questions, he's always willing to talk to us.
I could add to that.
Go ahead, please.
It is FHP policy to give you some information on victim advocates. And in the troop headquarters, they have their own victim advocate. In the other counties, they usually use the sheriff's departments or the state attorney's victim advocate. But it is the policy that they should be giving you that information in every single
They did send
case.
information.
Yeah, that's a necessity.
I had to ask for it. It took a while, but we did get that.
One of the things I'd like to bring up is the frustration of the officers, any of the traffic homicide investigators, and I know the other criminal investigators from the other departments. I had the difference when I worked Orange and Osceola County, and that state attorney, I would always be consulted when one of the people that I was responsible for putting in jail had violated probation, and they would ask for my input. When I went to Volusia County, every case that I had prosecuted, and there was no exceptions, they sent me a letter at some point just saying that the case was dismissed on the violation of probation. There was never any information. I'd never heard about the violation. It was just a standard thing where the judge would always dismiss it, and there was no exceptions. So there should be some standards throughout the state on the judges. The gentleman that had judicial watch, that they used to view the court cases, this state is desperate to need that kind of a system, because even for the elections, you have no information on those judges. They have no political affiliation, and they will not give you any information on those judges, and they keep getting reelected. There was a judge in Orange County that had been arrested for DUI, and for the next 2 years, she did not find anybody guilty of DUI. And every FHP case that came to her, she would not even hear. She would tell the state attorney, either let him plead to reckless or I'm dismissing it. And for 30 years, she was a judge in Orange County.
Wow.
In our case, the individual lived in Polk County. He had prior arrest in Polk County, and that's where he had his probation officer. And when he fled, no one really knows when he left, because he never would attend any of the pretrial hearings. So whether he actually ever met with his probation officer, we really don't have knowledge. He could have been gone longer than what we originally thought. It wasn't until we were setting a trial date and all that they discovered that he was no longer around. He went out for a pack of cigarettes, his mother said.
For 10 months.
His mother, he was like 50 years old, and his mother was still protecting him, so.
So we have time for one more question. Go ahead, sir.
I'm sorry? Okay. My name is Tony Tesaro. I'm not a police officer, and my heart goes out to you because my wife died of cancer. So I know the feeling of, and I was left with 3 little kids under the age of 8, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. But I do feel your pain, because no one realizes what you go through after you lose someone. Okay, I just want to say this. I've been here 20 years. And first of all, Manny, the article was wonderful. Congratulations to the Naples Daily News. It's a great article. Very sad, but it's a great article. I would normally be in Bible class right now. I covered in church. I'm taking a Bible course, but I had to come here because I am a driving instructor for over 30 years, one-on-one private lessons. I started in Fairfield County, which is Greenwich, Connecticut, Stamford. In Connecticut, package stores had to close 8 o'clock at night, and bars had to close at midnight. As we speak, they're having happy hour right now, or you can buy liquor all through the night, which means only one thing. You're going to drive, and that leads to a fatality. Being a driving instructor, I also was a teacher, meaning the learner's permit for kids 15 years old. And for those that don't know it, a 15-year-old does not have to have any experience at all to get a license. Just be 16 years old, have it for 1 year, and never touch the wheel and pass a 15-minute road test, and you get your license, which means you could drive to California. Not with me, but you could legally. Okay? Right. Number 2, BDI, people got tickets. I also qualified for that. Now, I don't know how long you've been here, but I've been here 20 years. Years ago, we used to publish the DUIs. Remember that, man? Were you here long? Okay. And of course, you don't do it anymore, because what would the neighbors think? I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, okay? But in the classroom, it was worse than Donald Trump's convention, okay? We had to close the doors. The room was full, and there was about 30, 40 people outside. So drinking in Naples, Florida is terrible. And I'm telling you right now, being a widower for 37 years and being here 20 years, it's not getting any better, folks. So I'm saying fasten your seatbelt and make sure you don't have a Tanaka airbag, which is defective, okay, because we're in for a long ride. So my question is, we know what the problems are. What's the solution? And that's what I teach my kids. Don't look for more problems. There's plenty of problems around. What's the solution? Because in my opinion, again, I'm 77 years old, I've been in it for a long time, I think it's a disgrace what's happening. Okay? That boy with all the money, he killed 4 people, and they fled to Mexico, correct? And then by your own article, he kills someone, and he's now in South America enjoying life. While the
In
other
Colombia.
people, right? While the other people had to bury the loved one and going through the pain like you're going through, and you're going through, and I had to go through 37 years ago.
Well, that's a really good segue. So as we wrap up here, I wanted to, what can be done, what's the takeaway as far as whether it's policy or legislative that you see that we can work on to just try to push forward to improve the situation? We'll start it with you, Scott.
Well, I think one of the things that can be done is the management part of it in each department. I can identify right now 2 departments that do it the right way. They put in all the personnel that needs to go into an investigation to get it done in a timely manner. They're competent people that have been trained. Each person in that investigation has a part, whether it's a scale diagram.
And what are those departments? What 2 are they?
Jacksonville and St. Pete.
Okay.
They put a lot of manpower into those things to get them done at the time. And they do it right. They've had the people that have the expertise, they've had the training, they've had the experience, and if they could use that as a model for the rest of the departments, I think that would go a great way in making this more of something that happens the way it's supposed to throughout the state. As far as labs are concerned, it's hard to do. We had the same thing when in Orange County you had an excellent medical examiner that used local labs. You have a medical examiner in Volusia County that used a lab in Indiana. So those things take time to get back, and there's nothing that controls anybody in any of the counties of the state of Florida. There is no operating procedure, standard operating procedure. Everyone makes their own decisions and are their own kingdom within that county. It should probably be more standardized.
In deference to the gentleman that just spoke, our accident happened at 5:30 in the afternoon. It was light out. He wasn't drinking. He was under the influence of drugs, and which may be another reason why everything's been so delayed, because of blood tests to determine the level of impairment, and they do have to use an expert at the University of Florida. He's the go-to person in the state. But I would like to say that I appreciate Naples Daily News having this forum, I think, to educate the public on what really happens in these cases. You know, you read these cases in the newspaper, like the young father around Christmas time that was killed, leaving behind a wife and 4 sons. Everyone feels so bad, and when I see those cases, it brings to mind our case, and I feel so bad for that family that is going through it, number one. And then number 2, I stop and think, they have no idea what they're going to have to go through to bring this to an end. And I think people, this forum and all the newspaper articles that Jacob has done so well, have educated a lot of people who knew that things just didn't work this way. And for the victims' families, it's nice to finally have a voice, because while we do go to pretrial hearings and we are advocates to find out what's going on and to be proactive, we go to a courtroom, we sit with a bunch of felons. They bring felons out in jail uniforms and handcuffs and shackles, and we never can say anything, and we have to sit there quietly. So after going through this for over 4 years, the fact that I can represent both families and finally have a voice to say how we feel, we're very grateful for that.
Well, it's a complicated question about what we can do to fix some of the problems, but I don't think we can indict the entire system and say that this is a rampant problem that we need to come in an emergency situation and revamp everything we do, because the reality is that if you look at statistical data of how many DUI manslaughters there are in this state a year, and you look at how many of those were arrested in an expedited manner, how many of those got the evidence back quickly, how many of those ended up getting convicted and serving lengthy prison sentence. And by the way, we get carried away sometimes thinking all these people get off with nothing. In Florida, if you get convicted, you're going to do between 12 and 15 years. That's where you're going to be. Now, that number can go up and down depending on how many counts you have, what other charges you have with it. But I was surprised that this gentleman who said 4 years, Florida's been past that for a long time. We're talking 12 years.
Is 12 the minimum?
On a first offense, you're going to score to about 12 years, yes.
Illinois is 3 to 14.
See, so Florida's way up there sentencing-wise. So, you know, we can't just indict the entire system and say there's this huge problem. Now, having said that, there are certainly cases that we know there are problems. We know these problems have existed for a period of time. We know there's a problem with training. This has been going on for some time. And I hate to keep harping on the same issue, but these labs are a major problem. I mean, you saw article after article about all of these sexual molestation cases where these female victims are sitting for years. Well, the DUI manslaughter cases are very similar. Oftentimes, the blood tests are put behind the rape cases. Those tests are done behind those. So the political importance of a sexual battery case is way above a DUI manslaughter case. So sometimes these things get pushed to the back. We need to think seriously about the way that our labs are conducted in Florida. We need to start thinking about local processing for testing that is simple. A first-year chemistry student at FGCU could come and do blood testing for alcohol. It's not complicated. So we need to think about what's simple and see if we can expedite that at the local level and revamp our system, because I think there's vast improvements can be made there. And I think if you'll go back and look at each of these cases that Jacob has chronicled, you will see that in almost all of them there was a significant delay in testing. Significant delay. I'm not talking a couple of months, I'm talking 8 months to a year for a simple test to determine alcohol in the blood. So we can localize some of this simple testing. We can make sure that when we're at the scene of these horrific incidents and it's mass chaos, that there's one person there in charge who is not only adequately trained to complete the evaluation and investigation, but that person's prepared to testify about it later. And maybe at the scene we need to think about a bifurcated investigative system where we've got the traffic homicide investigator who's paying attention to the scene and the cars and the skid marks and those things. And we have another trained officer who, these officers exist in every county, DUI specialist, who will take contact of the person that you suspect is driving impaired and conduct that part of the investigation at the scene. Then instead of one person doing all of these tasks at the scene and preparing one report that takes months and weeks to do, we could have a system where multiple officers are working towards the same goal, each of them specializing in different parameters. So I think we're asking too much sometimes of these homicide investigators for them to do everything. Interview the witnesses, take the pictures, gather the evidence, reach the conclusion, rush to the hospital and handcuff the defendant. It's too much. So, and it's back to training, and a uniform system needs to be created that in these cases will have multiple officers there to assist at this scene where there may be 50 people. There may be 50 emergency personnel at one of these homicide cases. That we have multiple officers there to assist in a uniform capacity with a set of guidelines and rules. So within 5 days of this accident, we've got a preliminary report ready to go to present to the prosecutors. And if there's enough evidence at the scene, we've made our probable cause arrest, even if it might be for a lesser crime that we could charge later, but we've made our arrest at the scene. So there's work that can be done. Any system can be improved, but this seems to be a situation that is happening too frequently with too many problems. So I think with a minimal amount of effort, we could fix a lot of these problems and solve some of the issues that we've talked about tonight.
Well, thank you. Scott, Sharon, Donald, I really want to thank you from the bottom of our heart for being here, joining us. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll be hanging out a little bit if you have any other questions, but really thank you for spending the time with us. I want to thank Jacob for his great work, and thank you for being here. Thank you so much.